Ladies and gentlemen, today I have the pleasure to welcome again Professor Elizabeth Schmidt. She is the former president of the African Studies Association, Professor Emerita of History at Loyola University Maryland. Professor Elizabeth, welcome back to Under the Human Rights Tree.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here again. I appreciate your invitations.
It's my pleasure. Today, I would love to discuss your book called Foreign Intervention in Africa After the Cold War, Sovereignty, Responsibility, and the War on Terror. And my first question will be, how the idea emerged?
Okay, thank you very much. The idea emerged really as a teacher of undergraduate students. I found that many of them held certain images in their mind about what was going on in Africa, and these were compounded by what they'd seen in the major media. And so if I said the word Africa, I asked them to brainstorm the first day of class, and they'd come up with all these different images, crisis, war, corruption, imploding from disease, starvation. And without meaning to, they essentially were blaming Africans for their plight, and sort of blame the victim idea. And, this view that, well, gee, they've had independence since the 1960s and they're in such a mess and what's wrong with them and why can't they get it together? And so it occurred to me at that time to write what's a sort of predecessor volume to this book, which was about foreign intervention in Africa during the period of decolonization and the Cold War. And so that was an earlier book that I wrote. And in that book and in its sequel, the one we're talking about today, I argued that many of the predicaments that plague the continent today are not solely the result of African decisions, but also the consequence of foreign intervention in African affairs. So I'm not absolving all Africans of involvement in this, but I'm saying what we aren't paying attention to is what role outsiders have played in the origin of these crises, the perpetuation of these crises, and the increasing potency and toll that these policies are taking on the African people. So that's the second book is the one we're talking about today, the one you introduced. And the motivation of this was, well, okay, what's happened since the end of the Cold War? What's happening today in Africa? And so it was an attempt to really bring it up to the present as much as possible. And to challenge the myths, the popular myths that many students hold and much of the general public holds. So that was the motivation.
I see. You may reflect on, many of us reflect on ideas of writing a book without doing it. But when you come to your case, you decided that you're going to go into a journey of writing a book and call the book Foreign Intervention in Africa After the Cold War,
Right.
and tackling subjects like sovereignty, responsibility, and the war on terror.
Yeah.
When did you decide that you will write the book?
Well, it's kind of a funny story because this has happened to me now with two different book projects where I wrote a long manuscript and it was much too long for the publishing houses to publish. And so I divided them into two, divided by time periods in the second case. So what had happened was when I was asked to write a book for the Cambridge University Press series about modern Africa. They proposed a different topic, and I said I'd really like to write one on foreign intervention during the Cold War. And they said, okay, fine, but the Cold War doesn't sell anymore. It was a marketing decision, so you need to bring it up to the present. But it had to be, a relatively short book. And so when I brought it up to the president, it was huge, and they said, this is very superficial. If you need to put some muscle on the bones here, and so the only way to do that for the Cold War decolonization was to cut out the post Cold War period, and so I just devoted a chapter, sort of looking ahead to what happens after the end of the Cold War. And I pulled all those scraps up and thought, well, maybe I can write a second book. And it turned out to be a much, much more difficult project than I'd imagined. And many times I regretted that I was doing it, but I was taught by my mother to finish what you've begun and always do my best. And so I had to set about learning what was the most reliable literature on this because I was not the first books I wrote were based on primary research. So let me back up. So I went to Zimbabwe to look at the impact of colonialism on women. That was my doctoral dissertation, which became a book. Then I
Mhm.
went to Guinea and I was looking at primary documents in the archives and interviewing people about the independence movement for Guinea Conakry. And for these two books on foreign intervention, I've not gone and done my own primary research. I've relied on the secondary sources, the books by people who themselves have gone and done that primary research. So it's a very different kind of project than I was used to. And what I had to do, since I wasn't an expert in any of the fields in the case studies, which we'll
Mhm.
describe, I had to know what was a reliable source. I mean, lots of people write about Libya, lots of people write about Somalia, lots of people write about Mali. I have to figure out which are the ones that are the most reliable and base my argument on what I find in those sources. So that's when I realized that the hugeness of the project. I really kind of balked, but as I said, I finished it. It took me a long, long time to write the book.
Can you just share the time frame around which year you basically the idea emerged and how long
It
it
took,
took
yeah.
you to finish the book?
Okay. Well, the book on foreign intervention during the Cold War came out in 2013. And the one on that we're talking about today after the Cold War was 2018. So it was 5 years. But I wasn't working only on that book during those 5 years. I was also teaching six
Mm,
courses a year at my institution, doing committee work, raising a child, all these things. So it wasn't like the process when I wrote my doctoral dissertation, I didn't yet have a family. And so the way I fooled myself into to working every day was to say, if I had a 9 to 5 job, I wouldn't just wake up one morning and say, well, I'm not inspired today. I'm not going to work on it. It's
mm,
like, no, you go and you work on it. And the inspiration comes as you begin to figure things out. So that was pretty well, it wasn't necessarily easy to do, but in those days there were no cell phones, there was no internet, there weren't a whole lot of distractions available if you stayed home all day. And
mm,
if my commitment to myself was, okay, I do nothing but work on the book or look at this blank screen today. The only enticements away were not really enticements. What? I could clean my house, I could wash the dishes, you know. So I could easily do the 9 to 5. Well, now I'm older for one thing, but I'm also much more distracted, I've got to say, by phones. I forgot to turn my phone off, by the way, before the interview. So yeah, just there are a lot of things that people do without thinking that break their train of thought, and that's kind of not a good thing. When
mm.
I'm working on a project, I say, okay, I'm going to devote 3 hours to this, and I'm not going to look at my email.
I
I'm
see.
going to put my phone on mute, and inspiration will come, and it did. It
I
did.
see. Eventually, you finish the
I
book
did.
and titled it "Foreign Intervention in Africa After the Cold War."
Yeah.
How did you come up with the title? Mm,
Well, it's funny. Again, there are these marketing decisions where presses will say if you've got some, poetic title, and then the subtitle is more substantive about what the book is about.
mm,
Um, it used to be that they let you do that. I mean, whatever sounded nice to you, that would be fine. Now they say no, the title itself has to have keywords in it that would come up in an internet search. And so foreign intervention in Africa after the Cold War. All right. It's
Mm,
pretty all right. We know what this book is about. And then the other parts are, sovereignty, responsibility, and the war on terror, which aren't as self-evident. Like, what is sovereignty going to have to do with this? What kind of responsibility? Well, it was responsibility for other human beings. The responsibility to protect is something that comes up and plays a large role in the book.
mm.
Um, so that's why. That's why. I mean, it was, this is what the press said. No, you've got to have one that's got all the keywords in the main part of the title.
In the title, if you look at the title, is precise foreign intervention after the Cold War.
Mhm.
Can you just describe us a little bit the situation of Africa during the Cold War before
Okay,
we go
sure.
into?
Sure, yeah.
Mm,
Well, what happened at the end of the Cold War is that many nationalist movements emerged. I mean, certainly some had been there before the end of World War II, but it really took off in the 1950s and 60s. And part of it was the impact of the war on many of the colonies that they had been forced to provide military conscripts, from the rural peasantry. The farmers in the rural area were forced to provide a certain amount of food for both the French and British military, but also for the urban areas in on the European continent that were being devastated by the war, and they got little to no pay for a lot of this work. And the military conscripts were actually quite radical when they returned from the war, and they said, we fought for freedom and justice and equality in Europe, and we come home to be sometimes not even second-class citizens, but just considered subjects of a sovereign. And, we fought for freedom and we want it here as well. And so decolonization began to be an issue that the Western powers had to deal with. The Soviet Union and China thought, well, this is an opening for us, and so did the United States. So, as much as the United States was allied with these European powers, it also saw a possibility of befriending these groups that are struggling for independence and benefiting when they come to power, as as their protectors. And it was a door open for trade and investment in markets that had not existed during the colonial period. So it's sort of the free trade idea that instead of the mercantile idea of colonization. Um, and so it really became a power struggle, first between the colonial subjects and the European powers, and then between the United States and the Soviet Union as to who was going to get these new independent states on their side. And so that was, most of the struggles had intervention by the Cold War superpowers.
I
Um,
see.
but after the war, it was neighboring countries, it was multilateral institutions, like the United Nations or the regional associations like ECOWAS in West Africa, the African Union. First, it was called the Organization of African Unity, but then after the Cold War, it became the African Union, and they sent a lot of military around. So it was a very different ball game after in terms of for what kinds of groups intervened after the Cold War.
I see. Let's go into the book. Um,
Okay.
by writing the book, how many chapters do you have in the book? And is it okay to go through those chapters?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not going to go into great detail through them because I really want to talk about the lessons, that we can take away from them. But
Mm,
the first few chapters are providing the background, and that would be kind of the end of the Cold War. Then laying out who are the actors in this second period, because it's so complicated. And
Mm,
so I go through each of the groups that were involved in the foreign intervention, and what their interests were. So that's the first three chapters are that. I think one of the chapters also sort of summarizes what the various case studies are going to show. Then from chapters 4 to 11, I have a case study, and they're based on region. So I touch on North Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa, and West Africa. And they're case studies that are not necessarily representative of all countries in the region, but case studies that have a lot of resonance, and they do speak for a lot of the same issues of countries that don't have case studies. So I looked at Somalia, Sudan and South Sudan, Rwanda, Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia and Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, and then the Arab Spring in North Africa, focusing on Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. And then the fallout from especially the Libyan um, situation, the fallout that spread to Mali and Nigeria. So those are the main chapters. And then the last two chapters are on U.S. policy after the Cold War, and that includes the first year of the first Trump administration, right? That he had won the election in uh, 20, what was it, 15, and yeah, and so I did write something about after his first year. Which
mm,
resonates in some ways with what he's doing now. Yeah.
I see. If you want to frame the post after Cold War,
Yeah.
which year we are talking about? What are the where the after Cold War began?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, I misspoke. Of course, he won the election in 2016, not 2015.
Okay.
And the he was in office in 2017.
Mhm.
Um, okay. The end of the Cold War is usually marked with the disintegration of the Soviet Union, which began in the late 1980s and kind of completed in early 90s. And um, Russia became the major power, but a lot of the Soviet socialist republics, they separated from Russia and became their own states, or
Mm,
they combined with other small ones into the states. But it's the early 1990s that are considered the end of the Cold War.
I see. In your book, did you have the chance to write or study in a deep length the notion of sovereignty in Africa?
Yeah, I did. I mean, that was one of the things that I dealt with in one of the first three chapters in terms of what it was all about, and that there were these new laws, new humanitarian laws that um, were recognized by the United Nations after World War II, when there'd been so much atrocity against human beings, against civilians. And it was kind of lessons learned from that. And the idea of just depending on the sovereign of the nation, like the head of state, to protect its citizenry was no longer one they could really claim, because a lot of the sovereigns had collaborated with the people who were hurting their citizenry, or they didn't have the means to stop events that were coming from outside. And so the idea was that those countries that have the capacity to stop a tragedy, human rights violation, genocide, it's incumbent upon them to do it, even if they're violating quote unquote state sovereignty. So that had been the basis of international law for centuries. The idea that if a sovereign is disrupting the peace outside of its territory, then they can be attacked. But whatever they do inside is none of the business of the other states, and that was no longer the case after World War II.
Oh, I think many people welcome that doctrine, the
Mm.
responsibility to protect, because in many African countries, um, leaders are not elected
Mm.
by the people, and sometimes they use uh, a small family that are running and killing whoever
Mm.
kind of is questioning their power. Therefore, many Africans intellectuals believe that the responsibility to protect and intervention of foreign countries can be a good thing
Yes. Yeah.
to install. So, how do you see the red line between sovereignty and the responsibility to protect? When when can we justify um, that dynamic? Because in one way, state are known the people should respect the sovereignty of any state.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
in some time, there is that doctrine that say if the government is abusing its power, foreign countries may intervene
Right.
to restore human
Yeah.
life. How did
Yeah.
you how did you analyze that
Yeah. Yeah.
situation in your book?
Yeah, yeah. It's a really tricky one because there's what's on paper that looks very good and there's what's happened in reality.
Mm,
And in reality, foreign states really aren't willing to use treasure and they're not willing to put aside the finances or their own military's lives for countries where they don't have an interest. And so the countries that have oil and uranium and chrome, they become places where there's lots of intervention and it's not always motivated by the responsibility to protect, even if it goes in under that cover. But it's about neighboring states and big powers that are further away wanting to get a share of that wealth and ignoring states that don't have those kinds of resources. So they're doing damage to the states that have the resources, but then they're also just turning away and shrugging their shoulders regarding states that don't have the resources. So, for instance, the Rwanda genocide in 1994. There was a notorious comment that's come out, in documents since then of someone on the Clinton administration's National Security Council who said, well, I don't see why we should intervene there. We have no interests there. And as a result, just let, nearly 1 million people get slaughtered. But then after that, the group that had stopped the slaughter became very dictatorial and very vindictive towards anyone from the ethnic group that had been the dominant ethnic group in conducting the genocide, right? So this administration went out after people of that ethnic group. So they sort of victimized, but the opposite group of people and um, the person on the Clinton National Security Council who had made the comments about, just ignoring the genocide in Rwanda, then became a main backer of this post-genocidal regime that was doing the same thing to the other people and just was blind to what Rwanda was doing in the Congo next door. Um, which was essentially stealing all their wealth and supporting rebel groups that were killing Congolese people so that they could get the wealth they wanted to rebuild after the genocide in Rwanda. I don't know if that I was clear enough in that, but it's been a chessboard that's being played with nobody being really the good guys. Lots of people who seem to be doing the right thing ultimately when they get power have struck out against other people who are at that point without power, or ignoring, that like the Trump administration, for instance, is very game to attack other countries. It attacked 7 different countries in 2025, and most in Africa and the Middle East. But we've seen the expansion now to Venezuela, kidnapping the president and his wife, um, just taking unilateral action because they can, but not staying to try to make sure that there's something rebuilt in the place of a dictatorship that they've overthrown. And the result is lots and lots of violence, lots and lots of fighting at the grassroots again by different groups vying for power after they've been under a dictatorship that had destroyed all opposition groups, all political parties, all trade unions, all, women's groups. That there was nothing to feed into a democratic state, and so they just descended into more division. And Trump again seems to be saying, we're not going to put our resources into state building. That's not what we do. But if you destroy a state without thinking about what comes next, you're bound to get a tragedy.
Mhm. Yeah, but based on your research, foreign intervention, basically what I'm getting um, about what you're saying is often interest is the main reason of intervention when you come to
Yeah,
foreign
yeah,
foreign and if a country doesn't have resources, often um, a powerful country will not trigger the responsibility to protect. Is it the
right,
case? Is it the
right.
case?
Yes, that's the case.
Mm.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
why you think this is the case?
People are greedy. People with power that's unlimited will often take powers and actions that are really contradictory to human rights and democracy. And we see it time and time again. And it's not just in Africa, not just in the Middle East. It's here at home in the United States. I think it's part of the human condition. Um,
I see.
Not
Ba-
that all people are evil, but that people have the capacity to do really evil, selfish things. And people have to be taught not to be that way, not to be in a survival of the fittest mode. And it's a very hard lesson to teach, and it's a hard one to transfer from one generation to the other. Um,
Mm, Also, based on your description of your book, you divided the African continent in many regions, in
mm.
different regions. Why you see the need of dividing the African continent in different regions?
Oh,
Do they have
um,
different realities or?
No, actually, I'm glad you asked that. It was to show that they have a similar reality, that
Mm,
these descriptions that I'm giving aren't just going on in East Africa or in the Horn of Africa. They're not just going on in Southern Africa or the Sahel. They're trends that have affected the whole continent, both in terms of the kinds of interventions by outsiders that have gone on, the kinds of resistance that's emerged, the consequences of the foreign intervention that's often been quite negative. And so I just want to make sure that people don't think, oh, it's only those Somalis or it's only those Libyans that do these things. No, this is across the board. And the outside actors are active in all of these different areas in the continent as well.
I see. You know, we all witness the Spring Revolution, the Arab Spring Revolution
Mm.
um, that create regime change and other consequences. How do you analyze that revolution in the northern Africa?
Yeah,
How
yeah.
how did
Uh,
were you able to what to find out based on your
well,
research?
yeah, the Libyan case, I go into especially because it had the most ramifications for sub-Saharan Africa. So while I looked at Egypt and Tunisia, as kind of background or kind of comparing how the Arab Spring affected them compared to Libya, I really delved more deeply into the Libyan case. And that is an interesting case because initially, the United States was very opposed to the Gaddafi government. Um, um, because it had nationalized, American oil and was, preaching an anti-imperialist message. They had some Soviet military advisors. So the US was convinced during the Cold War that they were just stooges of Moscow, which wasn't the case, but they did have these Soviet advisors. And so after the Cold War, interestingly, Gaddafi and the United States found they had some common interests, and that was stopping um, uh, the Islamist groups. And here I'm not talking necessarily about the violent jihadi groups, but just any group that thought that Islam should be the basis of um, daily life, government, that Islam was at the root of everything. And so Gaddafi started collaborating on trying to oust Islamists that threatened his complete hold on power, and the United States wanted them ousted for a different reason. And so they kind of made a pact, and Libya was, determined it wanted to have economic sanctions lifted so it could sell its oil, and it agreed, to get rid of, Soviet influences. That wasn't hard after the end of the Cold War, and they agreed to um, quit making weapons of mass destruction and um, various things that they wanted to do. And in exchange, not only were they getting more oil investment from the West, but they were getting a bonus for stopping sub-Saharan Africans who were traveling through Libya to the Mediterranean and across the Mediterranean to Europe, the boat people. And Gaddafi was paid a huge amount of money to stop them in Libya, and he sent them into what were essentially slave labor camps. And the European Union turned a blind eye to that. That's continued after Gaddafi's overthrow, and some of these like groups on the ground are getting paid again by Europe to keep the Sahelian refugees from crossing the Mediterranean. So there are all these common causes that allowed the US to join up with Libya after the end of the Cold War. Um, but that all that all ended with the Arab Spring, because the Arab Spring was essentially the European powers in the United States realized that they weren't um, they weren't going to win this thing, and so during the Arab Spring, it became clear that the protests in the civilian population and the military, the arising of a military force also fighting against Gaddafi, that Gaddafi's days were numbered, and
Mm.
the U.S. wanted to get on the right side of history, and so it agreed that a NATO-led bombing campaign would take place, and the U.S. was supplying drones, and France was supplying the airplanes. And what they were supposed to be doing was creating a safe space for infiltration, um, by taking out the Air Force, the Libyan Air Force. Oh, okay. So the case of Libya is a very interesting one because, as I mentioned, during the Cold War, the U.S. considered it an enemy with the Soviet advisors and its radical anti-imperial jargon that it often used. But when it was clear that Gaddafi's days were numbered, the UN Security Council at that point stepped in and imposed an arms embargo on Libya, sanctions against Gaddafi and his inner circle, and the Arab League even suspended Libya's membership and initiated contact with the rebels. Gaddafi then turned his military apparatus against civilians and rebel strongholds, and the rebel government urged the international community to impose a no-fly zone that would ground the Libyan Air Force and prevent it from attacking civilians. So they're essentially disarming Gaddafi. And the result was a UN authorized military intervention, and it was ostensibly to protect civilian lives, but in fact, the regime change had the operation had an unofficial objective, which was regime change, which is what just happened in Venezuela. And this was justified as a humanitarian intervention to protect civilian lives. That's not what it was about. So it wore a different face than what the reality was. Now, because Gaddafi had undermined Libyan civil society, that is, it repressed all institutions and forces that might challenge him. When he was overthrown, there was nothing, there were no political parties, no trade unions, nothing that could replace his rule. And so local militias, warlords, and violent extremists came to power. They filled the power vacuum. And the UN, in its operation, had not secured Libyan weapons supplies, their weapons stockpiles. So all of these extremist groups got a hold of the weapons. Um, Libya also had mercenary armies to protect him because he didn't trust his own army and not to overthrow him. And these mercenaries, these highly trained mercenaries from impoverished states in the Sahel, um, were now loose, and they went back home with the weapons. And that was the beginning of the insurgencies in Niger and Mali, and even as far away as Nigeria. And so the fall of the Gaddafi government had this fallout that hadn't been anticipated at all by the West. They'd made
Mm,
no provisions for it. And after what they'd done in Iraq and Afghanistan with these long, long stays and efforts at rebuilding, you know, uh, civil society and, democratic governments, et cetera. Uh, those were clearly failing, and so the U.S. said, "Well, we're not going to go into Libya and fix this mess." And so they had all of these different groups fighting against themselves, and to this day, I mean, there is not peace and prosperity there. So this is the reason I really dwelt more extensively on the Libyan case study in the book because one, it showed what happens when you don't think about the day after tomorrow,
mm,
and also because it had such an impact south of this the Sahel. And usually, well, not usually, but often in the popular presentations of Africa, the North African states are coupled with the Middle East rather than with Africa. And part of my uh, aim was to show that no, it's very much a part of Africa. It has impact on Africa, that the Sahara Desert is not a firm dividing line. And we think of the Tuaregs who went back to Mali and declared independence. They'd been battling with the Malian state for a long, long time because they were highly discriminated against in very impoverished, under-resourced area. And they went back with military training and weapons and declared independence, just as we see Somaliland declaring independence now. And what happened was the U.S. Was determined to crack down on them, and that actually backfired and resulted in Al Qaeda and eventually the Islamic State coming into this totally disorganized society. And that's what happened in Somalia as well, that we cracked down on the moderate Islamists, and the result was it opened the door to the violent jihadi extremists who hadn't been there before. So time and again, we see that the violence that we're often behind, or that the regional states are behind, backfires.
I see. In your book, I'm guessing you did also tackle the concept related to war on terror.
Yeah.
How do you define the concept um, in your book and its ramification?
Well, I would like to always put it in quotation marks.
Mm,
But publishers don't like you to do that.
Okay.
It's called a war on terror, but it was actually a terrorist war. I mean, the powers that were conducting raids against extremists were themselves responsible for killing a lot of civilians
Mm,
and supporting governments that were killing civilians. So, the governments in power that we were purportedly helping to protect were often the perpetrators of horrific human rights violations among the populations where the insurgents had, you know, rooted themselves.
mm,
But those people had nothing to do with it, and yet they were the targets of bombing and, um, you know, um, embargoes on food and all of those things. So it was really a war on the civilian population more than
I see.
anything. Yeah.
Yeah, you indicated writing in the process of writing the book, you didn't have the chance to go in the field. You
Mm,
rely on secondary sources. How
right.
challenging was it to get the information required to write the book you wanted to write?
It wasn't that difficult because I'm at a university that if it doesn't have the book or if it doesn't have the journal, the subscription to the journal, it can get it through interlibrary loan or in Maryland even more quickly, you can get it through a consortium of Maryland universities. So I could easily order a book that I've seen, reviewed or someone referenced it in one of their articles, and I could easily get a hold of that. And the journal articles would come as PDF files, and I might get them within the day that I ask
Mm,
for them. So what was hard was identifying who are the experts. And to do that, I consulted with many people whose expertise, from the time they wrote their doctoral dissertations was a particular country or a particular region. So as in my case, um, my background was Anglophone Southern Africa, especially Zimbabwe, and a little bit, I could say, Francophone West Africa, but really more specifically Guinea. That's where I'd done primary research. And other people had been in Sudan or Somalia, or so those were the people I consulted. And I actually even hired someone who is incredibly well versed in new books and publications coming out. A man by the name of William Minter, who runs the Africa Focus Bulletin. He's a sociologist and an independent scholar, and he I hired him to critique my chapters and to critique the way I laid out the book. And he's the one who suggested that I needed a chapter identifying all the actors and their interests at the very beginning, so that people can refer back to that as they're reading and say, okay, now who was it again who was in Mali? Who was it again who was in Nigeria?
mm.
And so that kind of feedback was extremely important to getting the book right.
You don't mind sharing few of those actors? Okay. Uh,
Uh, what do you mean? What actors?
who are involved? Because
Oh,
I,
in the various case studies?
yeah. Mm,
Well, I'd rather people just looked at the end of each chapter that I wrote. I
okay.
have a whole essay on suggested reading for that chapter. I mean,
Mm,
there are dozens and dozens and dozens of people, and I don't want to single out someone and leave out someone that, is key.
I see.
But that book, by the way, is available free as a PDF.
Mm,
So if people are interested in it, they can go to the Ohio University Press website,
okay.
and on my web page for my book, if you look under my title,
Mm,
halfway down the page, it says open access link. And
okay.
you double click on that, you get a PDF.
I see.
And so then they can look at for all the suggested reading sections for each of the chapters. And
Mm,
those would be the people that I group them, as, these people look at the pre-colonial period, these people look at the war on terror. This is particularly good for, these are the reminiscences of an American diplomat. These are the people who were interviewed. So it does break it down so you kind of have an idea, is that a source you want to look at?
Um, Often when somebody decide to write a book, there are goals. You you may have a goal. For instance, one of the goal you may have is just um, to do a critical studies, laying the facts on what is happening. And the other goal you may have is to provide a lesson based
Yeah.
on your studies, advocating for things. What was the reason for you when you came to your book for an intervention in Africa after the Cold War? Was it just to share the facts, what is really happening, or was it to call for, advocate for a better policies?
The latter, for sure. I've always been, or I've tried to be an engaged scholar who's learning lessons from history.
Mm,
And I started out before I went to graduate school and got a doctorate. I was very involved in the anti-apartheid movement in the United States.
mm,
And that very much influenced the kinds of subjects I wanted to broach in my academic research. And to look for lessons that we can learn that will help us in the future deal better, more effectively, more humanely when confronted by other crises. So, for instance, this book, obviously, I couldn't foresee what Trump is doing now, but there are all kinds of lessons about the weakness of foreign military intervention, and this from a man who, as I said, has attacked, 7 different countries in his first year in his second term of office, bombing Iran, Syria, Iraq, Nigeria, Yemen, Somalia, and Venezuela. Um, so it's you know that's really covering a lot of places in the globe, and I think what really I'd like to come from people reading the book is thinking of what kind of foreign policy we ought to have, and specifically, since I'm writing about Africa, towards Africa, and what would a progressive foreign policy look like? And I think what we need to do, and we don't do it often enough, is ask Africans what they want instead of prescribing what they think they want or what they think they ought to want. And so, it's not like we're bringing to them the idea of a better and a different society. In the early 1990s, you may recall, there were all kinds of African pro-democracy movements sprouting up, and the movements all had certain common things that they asked for: better education, employment, lots and lots of people without jobs, healthcare, clean water, sanitation, electricity, and roads, and with programs to rehabilitate rank and file fighters who'd gotten involved in some of the conflicts, and figure out ways to reintegrate them in society, and to keep them from falling back into violent extremism again out of desperation. Because one of the things that we've learned is that where a lot of the violent extremists have succeeded are in especially deprived areas. And some of the areas are those that have been affected by climate change, which, as we all know, has been driven primarily by the northern hemisphere countries in their pollution, and um, yet the detrimental effects have been disproportionately experienced in the global south. And so when we think of Nigeria and Boko Haram, for instance, in the Northeast, it turns out that a lot of the disenchantment with the Nigerian government has been the result of the drying up of Lake Chad. And Lake Chad had been the water that provided the farmers with crops and the herders with water for their livestock. And as they dried up, people were without employment, without a way of really making a living, with no education, formal education, and unable to obtain the either the money or the animals they needed in order to pay a bride wealth and get married and move from being a young man into a senior male position, which is what they would aspire to in their society. And they became easy targets for the violent extremists. That, it's like you're not going to get respect ever in your life. There's no way we're looking for it. We're looking towards it. But you could get people to fear you. And so that became the sort of second best, for a man who was aspiring to be acting like a man in his society. So um, we need to realize that military solutions aren't going to work. Quick military fixes are not the answer. We have to redistribute wealth effectively, and ensure that everybody has these basic human needs met. And we have to redefine what we think U.S. national security is all about. It's not about military defense of borders. It's about what the UN has adopted as global human security, where everyone has education, employment, healthcare, good sanitation, etc. And once those things are established, we're going to find that people tell them they don't want to leave their homes and families forever. They don't want to be migrants. They're doing it out of desperation. And we have to make the conditions better in their homes, which doesn't isn't really helped by dismantling U.S. Agency for International Development and the groups that it funded, because it often funded local groups who would actually do the jobs that they knew would resonate with people at the grassroots. So I think that's, one of the lessons we really have to learn is that the military is not the answer to these problems.
Um, I quite agree with that assumptions. But in some cases, do you don't think military intervention is needed based on your studies when you are dealing
I don't
with?
like to talk in absolutes, to say it's never justified or it is justified.
Mm,
I do know, again, looking at the Rwanda example, that there was a UN peacekeeping force there, and
mm,
they withdrew it as the genocide progressed because they said there's no longer any peace to keep. And
mm,
so instead of altering the mission to include protection of civilian lives, they just pulled everybody out.
mm,
So I think it really depends on how the mission is um, established and what it attempts to do. So, for instance, in Somalia, in 1990, the UN authorized a mission that was led by the US that was supposed to guarantee that food got to the civilians. And that wasn't working very well because of a lot of the activity on the ground with the various warlords. And so the UN gave the US a stronger mission, which was to capture particular warlords. And these warlords were now in effectively a civil war. And the US was essentially taking sides in the civil war and killing partisans, elders, from the other side, or even in one case, a group of elders who were meeting to consider a UN peace accord, and the UN bombed their meeting. I mean, not really knowing who they were killing at that point.
mm,
And so when the US wound up trying to kidnap the leader of the guerrilla movement that it didn't favor, the warlord it didn't favor. Its plane, the helicopters were shot down, and that's when the soldiers, the American soldiers, were dragged through the streets of Somalia, and the U.S. pulled out. But a lot of the things that provoked that crisis were the U.S. getting involved in a civil war. It was no longer just protecting and feeding civilians, and it got into a mess it didn't understand. And that happened again in Somalia. Um, about a decade later, they went back in and they were supporting warlords. There's a CIA involvement supporting warlords to take over because they didn't like the fact that the Islamists had more power, and these were not jihadi Islamists. These were a group that was working in the system. They were bringing law and order. They were bringing food to people. They were creating jobs. But because they were fundamentalist Muslims and the U.S. didn't draw a distinction between different groups of Muslims, they were targeted. And the U.S. facilitated Ethiopia's invasion of Somalia at that point. And, just all kinds of things that violated its sovereignty. And sure enough, Al-Qaeda eventually, teamed up with the people who were fighting against the U.S.-led CIA invasion and the Ethiopian invasion, and so that's an example of things gone wrong because of lack of understanding and lack of clarity about who was causing the damage and who was helping Somali people.
Mm. Based on your studies, do you think the failures of foreign interventions is due to lack of understanding of the African continent, or
Yes.
is due to real intent of destabilization? And I think you responded to the to the question by saying yes, this is due to
Y-
the lack of understanding.
yeah. Yeah.
What people need to do to better understand the African continent?
Well, I think what we need to do, for one thing, is we need to listen to African people. I mean, we
Mm,
go in with this superior, haughty attitude that we know what's best for them. And what we need to do is step back and look at civil society and the organizations that have emerged, the women's groups, the trade unions, ethnic associations, what have you, and see what is it that's important to them in their lives. What would they like to see a government do? And when there are peace initiatives, those people need to be included in the discussions. They shouldn't just be given some kind of peace accord that's been developed from beginning to end by um, warring parties with some outside observers and asked to enforce it. And anything that's enforced from above or outside is going to fail. I mean, people have to have a stake in it. And to have a stake in it, they have to be there from the beginning, voicing what their concerns are. And we
mm,
just don't get that time and time again. We leave out the people at the grassroots.
mm. I truly believe, despite writing your book in around 2013, I think the book's still relevant today. How do you see the relevance of your book um, when it comes to the situation in Congo, in which there has been a deal, at least a peace agreement signed at the White House?
Yeah, well, this has happened. I mean, I can't even count how many times there have been peace deals and peace agreements between Rwanda and the Congo, and the book does go into many, many, many of them, and they always have fallen apart.
Mm,
And in part, it's because the U.S. is very much interested in getting access to the same minerals that Rwanda wants and lots of other people want. And in some ways, chaos permits the sort of plundering of the Congo that um, continues, to this day. Millions and millions of people have died. Since the Rwandan genocide, have died in the Congo. And I haven't seen any evidence that this is going to be more successful, that they've included the right people finally in the discussions. It's again, be from the Trump administration. It's their deal, just like they're doing with Gaza and um, the West Bank in Palestine. That they're being handed a deal that outsiders wrote up, that they're not being included in it, and so it won't work.
If you have to rewrite your book, Foreign Intervention After the Cold War, do you have any ideas you think you will add into the book? that was not
No,
part of the initial.
I don't want to venture there because I'm not planning to write a sequel.
Mm,
I'm working on other projects, and I feel like I've said my piece, and now if people feel it's a road that's worth traveling, that they
mm,
will pick up the baton and carry it on down the road and do it in their way, right? So I
mm,
don't feel like anything that I ever do is definitive.
mm,
And I think there are a lot of questions it probably raises now, about the future, as you just did, that other people could do, and people with specialties that I don't have.
mm,
Um, but that, if they're going to do the whole continent, also they're going to have to find other people, whose secondary sources that they're going to read, because most people aren't going to do 11 case studies and do 11 in-depth, training in the history and current situation in the countries that are their subjects. Um, People spend a lifetime, on a particular country, and often in a particular decade, um, before they feel like they're suitably trained to do the primary research.
I see. After spending for many years analyzing foreign intervention in Africa, going deep into the notion of sovereignty, the principle of um, necessity to protect, and talking about war on terror. What was the conclusion of your book? What did you? What was your
Well,
final message on?
I think,
You know.
yeah, I think I was sort of explaining that the just that we need to change our foreign policy, that we need to have one that listens to the voices of people at the grassroots, finds out what they want, ensures that if we're involved in some kind of outside peace accord, that they be included in the discussion from beginning to end, that we redefine our notion of U.S. national security to be more in line with the UN global human security, that provides these basic um, qualities for all people, and that if we do that, then we're going to have a much more successful foreign policy.
And do you think the world is ready for that? Mm,
I think the people in power are not ready for that because it would entail they're losing some power. That's the catch. So in the United States, we need to elect different people to the Congress and to the White House, and we need to make better appointments on the Supreme Court, because it's not going to happen under this administration or a similar successor organization. They're definitely in love with military quick fixes that won't resolve the problem, but will, I mean, now there's talk about the US, invading Greenland, right, to get their critical minerals. I mean, it's it's the Wild West. And the Yeah.
do you have the impression that things are getting worse? Oh,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No
okay.
question.
Uh, Professor Elizabeth, I just want to say again, thank you very much for taking your time and discussing about your book, Foreign Intervention in Africa After the Cold War, Sovereignty, Responsibility, and the War on Terror. As you indicated, the book, if I'm not mistaken, is for free, you know,
Yeah.
and the people can always go and read about it in your website, or I believe you say Iowa University,
No, Ohio
Ohio,
University Press. So
Ohio.
put my name in Ohio University Press,
Mm,
put the title of the book in the search box,
mm,
and then you come to my web page there.
mm.
And partway down on the right-hand side, it'll say open access. And you click on that, and you can download the PDF.
Again, thank you, and I wish you a healthy and wealthy year, 2025. 26. I'm
Okay.
grateful that you are sharing your knowledge on situations that are affecting the African continent, problems that are affecting the African continent, and trying to use your experience to provide solution to those problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me again. Yes, I
Thank you.
appreciated it.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.